The emergency lights of the Galactic Council chamber pulsed with an anxious red glow as delegates from 47 species filed into the massive crystalline hall. High Chancellor Voreth of the Kethrani Imperium stood at the central podium, his forearms clasped tightly behind his back as he watched the empty seats in the human section. Those seats had never been empty in 500 years. The message had arrived 6 days ago, delivered personally by Ambassador Samuel Grant, a gray-haired human diplomat who had served the Council for 3 decades. Voreth remembered the strange expression on the human's face as he handed over the sealed document. It was not anger or sadness. It was something closer to exhaustion, the kind that settled into bones after years of thankless work. "We thank the Galactic Council for 5 centuries of partnership," the message stated in formal diplomatic language. "However, humanity has decided to withdraw from all interstellar affairs effective immediately. We wish the Council well in its future endeavors. Please do not attempt to follow us." Roth had read those words perhaps 100 times since receiving them. Each reading left him more confused than the last. The humans had built their entire reputation on being present, on showing up to every crisis and every negotiation and every minor dispute that threatened to become a major war. They were the species that never gave up on anyone, and now they were gone. Ambassador Zalira of the Veluxi Consortium approached the podium with clicking steps, her insectoid features arranged in what Vorath had learned to recognize as concern. "Perhaps this is simply a negotiating tactic," she suggested in a low voice. "The humans have always been clever in their dealings. They may be seeking better terms for their continued participation." "No," replied Fleet Admiral Koreth of the militant hegemony, his massive reptilian form casting a shadow across the floor as he joined them. "My intelligence networks have confirmed the truth. The humans have evacuated all their colonies in Council space. They have recalled every military vessel, every trade ship, every diplomatic envoy. Their stations have been dismantled. Their communication relays have gone dark." Voreth felt something cold settle in his chest. All of them? Every single one. They left nothing behind except automated warning beacons at their borders. The beacons transmit a single message on repeat: "Do not enter human space. Violators will be treated as hostile." The chamber had grown quiet as other delegates gathered to listen. Vorath could see the reactions spreading across the room like ripples in water. Confusion from some, relief from others. A few species had always resented human involvement in galactic affairs, viewing the soft-skinned mammals as meddlesome busybodies, stuck their noses where they did not belong. Delegate Mirren of the Silvari Collective was one such critic. She rose from her seat, her bioluminescent skin pulsing with satisfaction. "Then we should celebrate this development. The humans have finally recognized that their interference was unwelcome. The galaxy can now manage its own affairs without their constant supervision." Vorath watched several delegates nod in agreement, and he felt a growing sense of dread. These were young delegates, representatives who had come of age during the long peace. They had never known a galaxy without human mediation. They had never experienced what came before. "Delegate Mirren," Vorath said carefully, "do you know why the humans first came to the Galactic Council?" The Silvari delegate paused, her glow flickering with uncertainty. "They sought to expand their influence, I assume. To gain power and resources like any other species? No." Vorath activated the central display, projecting ancient records into the air above the podium. "When humanity first made contact with the wider galaxy, they discovered something that horrified them. They discovered that we had been at war with each other for over 10,000 years, not occasional conflicts, not territorial disputes, continuous, unending, total war. The records showed images that made several younger delegates gasp. Burning worlds, shattered fleets, species reduced to extinction. The galaxy before humanity had been a charnel house of competing empires, each one convinced that survival required the destruction of all others. The Kethrani and the Silvari fought for 2,000 years over a single moon," Vorath continued. "The militant hegemony conquered and exterminated 17 sentient species. The Veluxi developed weapons capable of rendering entire star systems lifeless. We were monsters, all of us, trapped in cycles of violence that we could not escape.
At!
Fleet Admiral Karath shifted uncomfortably. The hegemony's history was not something its current leadership liked to discuss. Then the humans arrived, Vorath said. Weak by our standards, short-lived, fragile. They possessed no natural weapons, no defensive adaptations, no inherent advantages in combat. Every empire assumed they would be conquered within a generation. What happened instead? Asked a young Veloxi delegate who had been listening intently. He to talk to us. Vorath pulled up a recording from the First Contact Summit, showing a human diplomat named George Patterson standing before an assembly of warlords. The human looked small and vulnerable, surrounded by beings who could have killed him with a casual gesture. But his voice was steady. We understand that you have been fighting for a very long time, Patterson said in the recording. We are not here to judge your history or demand that you change. We are simply here to ask one question. Are you tired yet? Because we think there might be another way. Vorath paused the recording on the image of Patterson's face. An ordinary human. Nothing special about his appearance. But the effect of his words had been extraordinary. Over the following centuries, the humans built something remarkable. They created diplomatic frameworks that allowed ancient enemies to negotiate without losing honor. They established trade relationships that made war economically foolish. They mediated thousands of disputes, spending years in negotiations that would have driven any other species to madness. And they did all this for free, Ambassador Zalira added quietly. They never asked for territory or tribute. They never demanded special treatment. They simply wanted the fighting to stop. Delegate Mirren's glow had dimmed considerably. Then why would they leave? Vorath looked at the empty human seats, and he thought about Ambassador Grant's exhausted expression. He thought about the countless times he had seen human diplomats working through the night, while other delegates slept. He thought about the thankless nature of their work, how quickly species forgot human contributions once a crisis passed. Because we never learned, Vorath said softly. We let them do the hard work for us. We let them carry the burden of peace while we continued to threaten and posture and scheme. And eventually they grew tired of carrying a weight that should have been shared. The chamber fell into complete silence. Outside the crystalline walls, the stars burned cold and indifferent. Somewhere beyond the borders of council space, humanity was building a new future for itself. A future without the burden of an ungrateful galaxy. And here, in the Great Hall of Nexus Prime, the remaining species of the Galactic Council were beginning to understand just how much they had lost. Vorath dismissed the historical display and looked out at the assembled delegates. We have a choice now. We can prove the humans' right to leave, or we can prove that their 5 centuries of effort were not wasted. I suggest we begin by learning to solve our own problems. No one answered. No one knew how to begin. The silence stretched on, heavy with the weight of a peaceful era that was already ending. 3 years had passed since the humans departed, and the galaxy was beginning to burn. Chancellor Vorath stood before the tactical display in his private chambers, watching red warning indicators multiply across the map like a spreading disease. The Corinth mining dispute, which humans had peacefully managed for decades, had finally exploded into open warfare between the Veluxi Consortium and the militant hegemony. The first battle had lasted only 6 hours. 40,000 dead. 3 space stations destroyed. 2 colony worlds rendered uninhabitable. His aide, a young Cathroni named Telvos, entered the chamber with another stack of reports. The young man's hands were trembling. Chancellor, the casualty estimates have been revised upward. The hegemony used plasma bombardment on the Veluxi mining platforms. Most of the workers did not have time to evacuate. Vorath closed his eyes. He remembered the last time tensions had flared between these two powers 15 years ago. A human envoy named Patricia Cole had been dispatched to handle the situation. She was a small woman with graying hair and tired eyes. The kind of person who would have been overlooked in any crowd, Patricia had locked herself in a conference room with delegations from both sides for 9 consecutive days. She did not sleep. She barely ate. Every time one delegation stormed out in anger, she followed them into the corridor and talked them into returning. Every time negotiations broke down, she found a new angle, a new compromise, a new way forward. on the 10th day. She emerged with a comprehensive peace treaty that addressed the core grievances of both parties. The agreement had held for 15 years without major incident. Patricia Cole had died of natural causes 2 years before the human departure. Vorith had attended her memorial service, one of the few alien dignitaries to do so. He remembered thinking that the galaxy would not see her like again. He had not realized how right he was. Send a message to the human territories, Vorath ordered. Request their immediate assistance with the Corinth situation. Offer whatever terms they require. Telvos hesitated. Chancellor, we have sent 7 such requests over the past 3 years. The humans have declined every one. Send it anyway. The reply came 2 weeks later. Delivered by an automated beacon that crossed into council space only long enough to transmit before retreating. The message was brief. Humanity appreciates the Galactic Council's communication regarding the Corinth situation. We are unable to provide assistance at this time. We suggest the involved parties seek a diplomatic resolution through the established council frameworks. 2 sentences. After centuries of partnership, after countless lives saved and wars prevented, the humans had reduced their relationship with the galaxy to 2 cold sentences. Fleet. Admiral Korath was furious when the response was shared at the emergency council session. This is unacceptable. We are offering them anything they want. Territory, resources, political authority. What more could they possibly demand? Perhaps they do not want anything from us, suggested Ambassador Xylira quietly. The Veloxi diplomat had aged visibly since the crisis began. Her own people were dying, and she was powerless to stop it. Perhaps they simply want to be left alone. Then we must handle this ourselves, declared Delegate Mirren of the Silverite Collective. Her earlier satisfaction at the human departure had long since faded. The Silvari border colonies were reporting unusual movements from hegemony fleet elements, and everyone knew what that meant. We have the frameworks the humans built. We have the protocols they established. We should use them. Vorith nodded warily. Ambassador Xylira, would you be willing to serve as mediator for the Corinth negotiations? The Veluxi ambassador agreed, though her compound eyes betrayed her doubt. She had observed human mediators for decades. She understood their techniques in theory, but understanding something and being able to do it were very different things. The first mediation session lasted 3 hours before Ambassador Xylira stormed out of the chamber, her mandibles clicking with frustration. They are impossible. The hegemony delegation spent 2 hours relitigating grievances from before my species achieved spaceflight, and my own consortium representatives kept interrupting with demands for immediate territorial concessions. No one would listen. No one would compromise. No one would even let me finish a sentence. Vorath found her in the observation lounge, staring out at the stars. The humans made it look easy, he said gently. The humans made everything look easy. Xylira's voice was bitter. Do you know what Patricia Cole told me once? She said the secret of human diplomacy was simple. Never give up. Never lose your temper. And always remember that the beings across the table are just as frightened and confused as you are. That does sound simple. It is not. It is the hardest thing in the universe. I lasted 3 hours before losing my temper. Patricia could go for weeks. Xylira turned to face him, her expression haunted. We are not humans, Chancellor. We do not have their patience. We do not have their stubbornness. We do not have whatever strange quality allows them to absorb endless frustration without breaking. Vorath had no answer for her. He could only watch as the red indicators on the tactical display continued to multiply. Within 6 months, the Corinth conflict had spread to neighboring systems. The hegemony, sensing weakness in the Council's response, launched preemptive strikes against Silvari border colonies. The Veluxi retaliated with attacks on hegemony supply lines. Other species began choosing sides, remembering old alliances and older grudges. By the end of the year, the Corinth system was a graveyard. Shattered vessels drifted among the debris of what had once been thriving space stations. The surfaces of contested worlds glowed with the aftermath of orbital bombardment. The few survivors huddled in emergency shelters, waiting for rescue that might never come. Telvos brought the final casualty reports to Voreth's chambers. The young aide could barely speak. 2 million dead, Chancellor. In a single year. Overmining writes that the humans had managed peacefully for generations. Vorath took the reports but did not read them. He already knew what they would say. He had watched this disaster unfold in slow motion, powerless to stop it. Cursed with the knowledge of how easily it could have been prevented, the Sylvari Collective has announced a formal alliance with the Veluxi Consortium, Telvos continued. They are demanding that the hegemony withdraw from all disputed territories. And the hegemony's response? They are mobilizing their full war fleet. They say they will not be intimidated by what they call an alliance of weakness. Vorath walked to his window and looked out at the peaceful skyline of Nexus Prime. This world had known peace for 5 centuries, protected by human diplomacy and human sacrifice. Now that protection was gone, and the old darkness was returning. Summon the council, he said quietly. We need to discuss emergency measures. But even as he spoke the words, Vorath knew they were already too late. The galaxy had forgotten how to make peace on its own. The humans had carried that burden for so long that no one else remembered how to lift it. And now everyone would pay the price for that forgotten knowledge. Chancellor, Vorath spent his nights in the deep archives beneath Nexus Prime, searching through records that had not been accessed in centuries. The ancient data crystals hummed with stored memories of an era that most species preferred to forget. But Vorath needed to remember. He needed to understand what the galaxy had been before the humans came, so he could understand what it was becoming again. The records were worse than he had imagined, before humanity's arrival. The galaxy had known nothing but endless, grinding, merciless war. The Kathrani Imperium, his own people, had once been conquerors of terrible reputation. They had burned worlds for the crime of existing too close to Kathrani territory. They had enslaved populations by the billions. They had committed atrocities that Vorath could barely bring himself to read about. And the Kathrani had not been the worst. Not even close. The militant hegemony had earned its name through campaigns of systematic extermination. 17 sentient species had been wiped from existence by hegemony forces. Their worlds sterilized, their cultures erased, their very names forgotten. The records contained images of hegemony victory celebrations. Held on the ashes of dead civilizations, the Veluxi Consortium had developed weapons of such devastating power that entire star systems had been rendered permanently uninhabitable. The Sylvari Collective had practiced biological warfare, engineering plagues that could target specific genetic profiles. The smaller powers had been just as brutal within their limited spheres of influence. For 10,000 years, this had been the normal state of the galaxy. War without end. Genocide as standard policy. Every species convinced that survival required the destruction of all competitors. Then the humans. Appeared Vorath found the first contact records and studied them carefully. The human explorers had been traveling in a small vessel, barely armed, clearly not designed for military operations. When they encountered a Kathroni patrol squadron, everyone expected them to be destroyed or captured. Instead, the human captain, a woman named Dorothy Walsh, had opened communications and asked to speak. The Kathrani commander had been so surprised by this behavior that he agreed. Dorothy Walsh spent 6 hours talking with him, asking questions about Kathrani culture and history, expressing genuine interest in understanding his people. By the end of the conversation, the commander had provided the humans with star charts and a formal introduction to the Kathrani. Diplomatic corps, similar scenes played out across the galaxy as humans made contact with other species. They approached everyone with the same strange combination of openness and patience. They seemed genuinely unable to understand why species would choose war over cooperation. They kept asking the same basic question. Would you not prefer peace? Most species initially viewed the humans as naive fools who would soon learn the harsh realities of galactic politics. But the humans refused to learn. They refused to accept that war was inevitable. They refused to believe that ancient hatreds could not be overcome. And slowly, impossibly, they began to change things. The first human-mediated peace treaty was signed between the Kathrani Imperium and the Sylvari Collective after a war that had lasted nearly a century. The The human negotiator, a patient man named Henry Morrison, spent 3 years working on the agreement. He learned both languages fluently. He studied both cultures in depth. He came to understand the core grievances on each side better than most of the actual participants. When the treaty was finally signed, both delegations admitted that they had never truly believed it was possible. They had entered negotiations expecting them to fail, planning to use the failure as justification for renewed hostilities. But Henry Morrison had simply refused to let them fail. Every time negotiations broke down, he found a way to restart them. Every time one side walked away, he followed and talked them back. Vorath found a recording of Henry Morrison speaking after the treaty signing. The human looked exhausted, his hair graying, his eyes lined with fatigue, but he was smiling. "Peace is not a destination," Morrison said in the recording. "It is a prac. Tice, it is something you must choose every day, in every interaction, in every moment of frustration and anger. The Kathrani and the Silvari have chosen peace today. Tomorrow, they will need to choose it again. And the day after that, forever." The interviewer asked Morrison if he thought the peace would last. "I do not know," Morrison admitted, "but I know that it is possible. That is enough. As long as peace is possible, it is worth fighting for." Vorath paused the recording and sat in the darkness of the archive, surrounded by the ghosts of a violent past. He thought about the current state of the galaxy, about the wars spreading across multiple sectors, about the alliances forming and the old hatreds resurfacing. The humans had given them 5 centuries of peace. 500 years in which species that had once tried to exterminate each other learned to coexist. 500 years of trade and cultural exchange and gradual reconciliation, and in 3 short years, it was all falling apart. Vorath pulled up more recent records, searching for any information about why the humans had decided to leave. He found reports from human diplomats stationed throughout Council space, filed during the years leading up to the departure. The reports painted a disturbing picture. Human mediators describing delegates who refused to negotiate in good faith. Human peacekeepers complaining about being undermined by the very governments they were trying to help. Human administrators noting that their recommendations were routinely ignored, their warnings dismissed, their expertise taken for granted. One report, filed by a diplomat named Carol Bennett, stood out in particular. It was written just 6 months before the departure announcement. "I have spent 40 years serving the Galactic Council," Carol wrote. "In that time, I have mediated over 200 disputes, prevented at least a dozen major wars, and helped negotiate countless trade agreements. I have given my health, my family, and my youth to this work. And today I was told by the Veluxy delegation that human involvement in galactic affairs is becoming tiresome. They said we should learn to mind our own business," the report continued. "I tried to explain that without human mediation. The current trade disputes would likely escalate into armed conflict within 5 years. The delegation laughed. They said I was being dramatic. They said the galaxy no longer needed human supervision. They said it was time for humanity to step aside and let other species take the lead." Carol Bennett's final line was simple. "Perhaps they are right. Perhaps it is time." Vorath closed the record and sat in silence. He thought about all the times he had taken human assistance for granted, all the times he had assumed they would always be there to clean up the messes that other species made, all the times he had failed to thank them, failed to support them, failed to share the burden of maintaining peace. We drove them away, he realized, not with violence or threats, but with ingratitude and indifference. We made them feel unwanted and unappreciated until they finally believed us. He left the archives as dawn was breaking over Nexus Prime. The sky was beautiful, painted in shades of purple and gold, but Vorath could not appreciate it. He could only think about the darkness that was coming, and how easily it could have been prevented. His communicator chimed with an emergency alert. The Silvari Collective had formally declared war on the Kathrani Imperium over trade route disputes. The very peace that Henry Morrison had worked 3 years to build, the peace that had lasted for 5 centuries, had finally collapsed. Vorath looked up at the fading stars and wondered if the humans were watching. He wondered if they felt vindicated or saddened. He wondered if they would ever forgive a galaxy that had treated their gifts with such careless contempt. Somewhere in the distance, the first explosions of the new war began to light up the sky. 5 years after the human departure, Chancellor Vorath stood on the bridge of the diplomatic vessel, Harmony's last hope, and watched the assembled fleet stretch across the void of space. 12 species had contributed ships to this mission, former enemies traveling together toward the distant borders of human territory. It was the largest peaceful gathering in galactic history. It had only one purpose: to beg humanity to return. The fleet had taken months to assemble, convincing species that were actively at war with each other to cooperate on a joint mission had nearly killed Vorath. He had aged decades in those negotiations, learning through bitter experience just how difficult the work of peace truly was. But they had succeeded somehow. The Veluxi and the Hegemony had agreed to a temporary ceasefire. The Silvari and the Kathrani had set aside their conflict long enough to contribute vessels. Even minor powers that had been fighting proxy wars against each other had sent representatives, all of them desperate, all of them finally understanding what they had lost. The journey to human space took 3 weeks. During that time, Vorath spent hours in meetings with the other delegation leaders, trying to maintain the fragile cooperation that had made the mission possible. Old grievances kept resurfacing. Ancient insults were remembered and repeated. Several times, the entire enterprise nearly collapsed into violent crimination, but they held together. Barely, when the fleet finally reached the human border. They found exactly what the warnings had promised. A wall of automated defense platforms stretched across the approach, bristling with weapons that made even the Hegemony Admiral nervous. Warning beacons repeated their endless message: do not enter human space. Violators will be treated as hostile for 3 days. The fleet waited at the boundary while Vorath sent message after message requesting an audience. Most were ignored. A few received automated responses confirming that the messages had been received and would be processed according to standard diplomatic protocols. On the 4th day, a single human vessel emerged from behind the defense line. It was small and unassuming, the kind of ship that would have been overlooked in any commercial port. But the fleet commanders understood its significance. After years of silence, the humans were finally willing to talk. The view screen in Vorath's conference room flickered to life, revealing a young human male with tired eyes and dark hair. He wore simple civilian clothes, nothing that suggested military or diplomatic rank. His expression was polite but distant, like someone performing an unpleasant duty. "I am Kevin Park, border liaison for this sector," the human said. "Chancellor Vorath, I have been authorized to receive your petition and relay it to my government. Please proceed." Vorath had prepared his speech for months. He had agonized over every word, trying to find the perfect combination of humility and urgency that would convince the humans to reconsider their decision. But now, facing this young man with his distant eyes, all the prepared words seemed hollow. "We have come to ask humanity to return to the Galactic Council," Vorath said simply. "The galaxy is destroying itself without your guidance. Wars have spread across every sector. Billions have died. Ancient civilizations are crumbling. We need your help." Kevin Park was quiet for a long moment. His expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. Something that might have been sadness, or might have been resignation. Chancellor, I appreciate you making this journey, and I will relay your petition faithfully. But I must be honest with you. The answer will almost certainly be no." Fleet Admiral Korath, who had been watching from the side of the room, stepped forward with barely contained frustration. "Why? We are offering you everything. Territory, resources, political authority, unlimited access to council space. Whatever you want, name your price." "Hey, there is no price," Kevin said, and his voice carried a weariness that seemed far older than his years. "This is not a negotiation. Humanity did not leave because we felt undervalued or because we wanted better terms. We left because we were exhausted." Ambassador Xylira approached the screen, her mandibles clicking softly. "Then rest. Take a decade, take a century if you need it. But please, do not abandon us forever." Kevin shook his head slowly. You do not understand. We spent 5 centuries trying to teach you how to live in peace. We built institutions. We established protocols. We trained thousands of your diplomats in our methods. We gave you every tool you needed to maintain stability without us. We were not ready, Xylira pleaded. You were ready. For the first time, a hint of emotion crept into Kevin's voice. You had everything you needed. You simply chose not to use it. The moment we left, you threw away 500 years of progress and went back to killing each other. Not because you had to, because it was easier than doing the hard work of peace. Delegate Mirren of the Sylvari, who had once celebrated the human departure, stepped forward with her bioluminescence dimmed to almost nothing. We made a mistake. We admit that now. Please, give us another chance. Kevin looked at her for a long moment. How many Sylvari have died in the current conflicts, Delegate? Mirren hesitated. I do not have exact figures. 147 million. I checked before this meeting. 147 million Sylvari dead in 5 years, in wars that did not need to happen. Over disputes that could have been resolved through dialogue. Kevin's voice remained calm, but his eyes had hardened. Do you know how many humans died defending Sylvari territory during the border conflicts of the previous century? Mirren did not answer. 8,000 human peacekeepers who gave their lives protecting a species that now tells us our interference was unwelcome. Kevin paused, letting the numbers sink in. We gave you our blood. You gave us contempt. Conference room fell silent. Vorath could see the other delegates struggling with emotions they had never expected to feel. Shame, guilt, the dawning recognition of how badly they had failed. We are building something new, Kevin continued, his voice softening slightly. Our own civilization, our own future, our own peace. We are raising children who will never know the burden of being the galaxy's conscience. We are creating art and music and literature without interruption. We are finally living for ourselves instead of for others. The view screen flickered, and for a brief moment, Vorath glimpsed what lay behind the young human. Green fields stretching toward distant mountains. Children playing in a park. Adults laughing together at a community gathering. A world at peace, genuinely and completely at peace. We gave the galaxy 500 years, Kevin said quietly. Generations of humans who sacrificed their lives and their happiness for species that barely acknowledged their efforts. We have nothing left to give. The well is empty. Vorath felt tears forming in his eyes, an emotional response that surprised him. Is there nothing we can say? Nothing we can do? Kevin was silent for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was almost gentle. Learn to save yourselves. Learn to do what we tried to teach you. Not because we will come back if you succeed, but because it is the right thing to do. That is all we ever wanted, Chancellor. We wanted you to choose peace because peace is worth choosing. Not because we forced you, not because we bribed you, but because you understood its value. And if we fail, then you fail. And humanity will mourn what might have been, but we will not return to carry a burden that you must learn to carry yourselves. The transmission ended. The view screen went dark. The fleet waited at the border for 3 more days, hoping for a change of heart that never came. Finally, Chancellor Vorath gave the order to return home. The greatest diplomatic mission in galactic history had failed, and there was nothing left to do but face the consequences of 5 centuries of taking peace for granted as the fleet turned away from human space. Vorath looked back at the wall of defense platforms one last time. Somewhere beyond those barriers, humanity was building a future without the galaxy that had used them and discarded them. He wondered if the galaxy deserved a second chance. He wondered if anyone would be left to ask for one. 10 years after the human departure, Chancellor Vorath walked through the ruins of the Great Council. Chamber on Nexus Prime. The crystalline walls that had once soared toward the heavens now lay shattered across the floor. Their beautiful refractions turned to jagged edges and broken dreams. Smoke still rose from distant sections of the city, where fires continued to burn unchecked. The Nexus War, as it would be called by whatever historians survived to record it, had lasted 18 months. Every major power had participated. Every ancient grudge had been settled in blood. The galaxy that humans had worked so hard to unify had torn itself apart with a thoroughness that would have impressed even the warlords of the pre-human era. Voreth was old now, his fur more gray than gold, his forearms weakened by age and injury. Most of his generation had died in the conflict. Telvos' faithful aide had fallen defending a medical convoy from hegemony raiders. Fleet Admiral Korath had gone down with his flagship during the Battle of Corinth. Ambassador Xylira had been assassinated by her own consortium for the crime of advocating peace. Delegate Mirren of the Sylvari had survived. Though she was barely recognizable, the bioluminescence that had once marked her species had faded to almost nothing, a biological response to prolonged stress and trauma. She had lost 3 of her 4 children in the war. Vorath found her sitting among the rubble of the Sylvari delegation section. Staring at nothing. "It's over," he said, lowering himself carefully onto a fallen pillar. His old bones protested the movement. The ceasefire was signed this morning. All parties have agreed to stand down. A ceasefire, Mirren repeated. Her voice was hollow. Not a peace treaty. Just a pause while everyone rebuilds their fleets for the next round. Vorath did not argue. He knew she was probably right. The patterns of galactic history were deep and strong, carved by 10,000 years of violence. 5 centuries of human influence had only temporarily interrupted them. But as he sat in the ruins, watching dust motes drift through shafts of sunlight, Voreth noticed something he had not expected. Other survivors were gathering in the destroyed chamber. They came in 1s and 2s, picking their way carefully through the debris. Looking around with expressions of loss and confusion, young faces, most of them. Children of the war, raised in shelters and evacuation ships and refugee camps. They represented a dozen different species, former enemies who had every reason to hate each other. Yet they had come here together, eh? Young Veluzzi approached Vorath with hesitant steps. Chancellor, is it true that this place was once the center of galactic government? That species from across the galaxy would come here to talk instead of fight? It is true, Voreth said. For 500 years, this chamber was where wars ended and peace was made. The humans built it, did they not? My grandmother told me stories about them. She said they were strange creatures who believed that talking could solve any problem. Voreth smiled sadly. They did believe that. They were very strange indeed, where survivors gathered as word spread that the former chancellor was holding court in the ruins. They came from every background and every faction, drawn by curiosity or desperation, or simply the need to be near others who understood what they had lost. A small Sylvari child, her bioluminescence barely visible, approached Mirren and tugged at her robes. What do we do now? Mirren looked at the child, then at Vorath, then at the gathered crowd of survivors. For a long moment, she did not speak. When she finally answered, her voice was stronger than it had been in years. Now we learn. Vorath felt something stir in his chest. Something he had not felt in a decade. Hope. Small and fragile, but real. The humans tried to teach us something, he said, raising his voice so all could hear. For 500 years, they showed us how to resolve our differences without violence. They built frameworks and protocols and institutions. They demonstrated again and again that peace was possible. But they left, said a young hegemony soldier, his scales scarred from combat. They abandoned us. No. Voreth stood, drawing on reserves of strength he had not known he still possessed. They did not abandon us. They freed us. They stopped carrying a burden that was never theirs to carry. The burden of our peace, our future, our survival. That burden belongs to us. It always belonged to us. We just let them carry it because it was easier than carrying it ourselves. He looked around at the gathered survivors. Veluxi and Hegemony standing side by side. Sylvari and Kathrani sharing water from the same container. Species that had been killing each other mere days ago, now united by the simple need to survive. We can choose to return to what we were, Voreth continued. We can rebuild our fleets and nurse our grudges and wait for the next war. That path is easy. It requires nothing of us except the willingness to watch our children die, or, prompted the young Veluxi. Or we can choose differently. We can learn to do what the humans tried to teach us. Not because they will reward us for it, not because they will return if we succeed, but because it is the right thing to do. Because peace is worth choosing. The Silvari child looked up at Mirren. Can we really learn? Are we smart enough? Mirren knelt down to meet the child's eyes. The humans were not smarter than us. They were not stronger or faster or more powerful. They were just more stubborn. They refused to give up on peace, no matter how many times it failed. That is all the secret they ever had. Stubbornness in the service of something good. Voreth nodded. So we will be stubborn too. We will talk when we want to fight. We will listen when we want to shout. We will compromise when we want to demand. And when we fail, because we will fail, we will try again. And again. And again? For how long? Asked the hegemony soldier. For as long as it takes. Forever, if necessary. The gathered survivors looked at each other, seeing enemies and strangers, and perhaps for the first time, something else. Potential allies. Potential friends. Potential partners in the hard work of building something better. It would not be easy. The scars of the war ran deep, and the patterns of violence were ancient. There would be setbacks and failures and moments when everything seemed hopeless. There would be those who refused to change, who clung to hatred because it was familiar. But there would also be those who chose differently. Those who remembered what the galaxy had been during the human era and fought to reclaim that peace. Those who taught their children that enemies could become friends, that wars could end, that the future did not have to repeat the past. Far away, beyond the borders of council space, a human astronomer named Linda Shaw sat in her observation post and studied data streams from distant sensors. She was monitoring the aftermath of the Nexus War, tracking the slow process of reconstruction and recovery. The data showed something interesting. Instead of the expected pattern of continued hostilities and renewed conflict, the surviving species seemed to be cooperating. Joint reconstruction efforts. Shared resource distribution. Emergency medical aid crossing factional lines. Linda noted the observations in her log and forwarded the data to the cultural archive. She added a personal comment, 10 years of war, and they are finally learning. The hard way, but learning. Perhaps there is hope for them after all. She returned to her telescope and looked out at the peaceful stars of human space. Her own world was beautiful and calm, untouched by the violence that had consumed the galaxy. Her children would grow up without knowing war. Her grandchildren would never have to carry the burden that previous generations had borne. But part of her still watched the distant lights of council space with something like affection. They had been terrible students, ungrateful and stubborn and frustrating beyond measure. They had wasted centuries of human effort and sacrifice, and yet they were trying. Finally, belatedly, at a cost measured in billions of lives. They were trying to learn what humanity had always wanted to teach them. Linda smiled and allowed herself a small moment of hope. Perhaps the lesson would stick this time. Perhaps the galaxy would finally grow up. And perhaps someday, when the children of Nexus Prime had truly learned to keep the peace on their own, humanity would open its borders once again. Not to save the galaxy, but to rejoin it as equals. That day was far away, if it came at all. But for the first time in a decade, it seemed possible, in the ruins of the Great Council Chamber. Chancellor Voreth led the first meeting of what would eventually become the new council. The agenda had only one item: how to build a lasting peace. The discussion would take years. The work would take generations. But it had finally begun. And somewhere among the stars, Linda Shaw watched and waited and hoped.